Hi, folks. This is the seventh lecture episode in an eight-part series of lecture episodes on New Testament Christology. I have very much enjoyed it. I hope you have too. The last episode was on Pauline Christology. This one is on Gospels Christology. A couple of words of clarification. Because we already talked about the Christology of Jesus, and because that is so intimately related to a study of the Gospels and their Christology, I won't have as much to say as one might normally have to say if they had to cover all of that ground. But I also want to say that usually when scholars talk about a study of the Christology of Jesus, they focus upon a few episodes in the life of Jesus to explicate what seems to be going on in Jesus' own mindset with respect to who he thinks he is and the purposes of God. And when scholars talk about Gospels Christology, they're not just talking about those select few episodes in the life of Jesus, but the artistic and narratival shaping that have been given to the life, the mission, and message of Jesus by all four evangelists as creative theologians themselves. So it is necessary to see Jesus' Christology and Gospels Christology as intimately related. It's also appropriate to see a distinction between the two areas of study, though they are related. I also will say a few words about some of the non-canonical Gospels and some of the features that they reflect. First, let's talk about the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and some of their distinctive features. Mark is probably the first Gospel, as I've said before, written somewhere in the 60s or 70s. And Mark is a rapid moving action film, as it were. Not much, unlike the cases of Matthew, Luke, and John. Direct teaching of Jesus, long discourses of Jesus, parables of Jesus, a couple of those, but not much of that in Mark. Just lots of Jesus doing things. Lots of Jesus announcing the kingdom of God, and particularly lots of Jesus casting out demons. The demonic forces, as Jesus' primary enemy, as the primary rulers of this world, as the primary antagonists in the story of Jesus, the protagonist establishing the kingdom of God, is a major, major feature of Mark's gospel. Mark begins the story of Jesus by reference to Malachi 3, by reference to Exodus, and by reference to Isaiah 40, in talking about the Lord sending someone to prepare the way ahead of his own return, ahead of Yahweh's own return back to save and to rescue his people. Then Mark introduces John the Baptist as that very Elijah-like messenger, and then immediately introduces Jesus. The point obviously being for Mark, shocking though it is in this early gospel, is that John the Baptist is preparing the way for the return of the Lord, and Jesus seems to be, within the narrative of Mark, the returning Lord, coming back to his people to rescue and to save. And indeed, right as we get into Mark 2, Jesus, as the returning Lord, is already rescuing, healing the paralytic in chapter 2, announcing the forgiveness of his sins, which is a prerogative of Yahweh alone. Then many further chapters thereafter are taken up with healings, the walking on the water, the proliferation of the loaves for the people, all sorts of miracles designed to demonstrate that, among other things, Jesus is the returning God of Israel to his people to rescue and to save. And of course, Mark climaxes with the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the crucifixion, which is precipitated in part by the trial in which Caiaphas asks Jesus just who he thinks he is the Messiah. Jesus answers affirmatively, explicating that affirmation by a double quotation of Daniel 7 and Psalm 110, suggesting that Jesus will be exalted by the clouds of heaven up to the Ancient of Days, that's Daniel 7, and he'll be enthroned on God's own throne next to Yahweh himself. Such that when you read the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is somehow Yahweh in person and also Yahweh's Son. And that complexity of holding that together as Jesus is the returning Yahweh, And Jesus is the Son, upon whom the Spirit descends at his baptism, upon whom the glory shines and descends at the transfiguration, and the Son whom is the object of the divine Father's resurrection. That dynamic of, yes, he's Israel's God in person, and yes, he's the Son of Israel's God, is an interesting and fascinating feature of Mark's Gospel. Much the same could be said of Matthew, except we want to add in at this point with Matthew that Matthew has a thoroughgoing Moses typology where Jesus is depicted as the great Mosaic leader that comes back to the people, yes, as Israel's God, but gives them a new and eschatological Torah, a new way of being faithful to Torah and being the people of God. Jesus is both the one who gives the new Torah and the one who is the Torah. He's wisdom returning to his people. That's another feature of Matthew's Gospel. A particularly fascinating feature of Matthew's Gospel over and atop what Matthew incorporates from Mark is the Emmanuel theme in Matthew, where at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, that is quoted from the book of Isaiah, that prophecy, behold, a virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son, and his name shall be Immanuel, which means the with, in Hebrew, the with us God, or the God who is with us. The feature of Matthew's Gospel, that Emmanuel feature where Jesus is God with us, characterizes a lot of Matthew's Gospel. And indeed, one ought to hear an echo of the opening chapter at the end of Matthew's Gospel where Jesus says, and lo, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. Matthew's Gospel is bookended by Jesus as God with us. Lots of Davidic messianism in Matthew's Gospel, but I'll highlight that with respect to Luke's Gospel. Luke is emphatic, yes, on the point about Jesus as a new Moses, Jesus as a new Elisha. That's important in Luke as well. Of course, John the Baptist is typecast as the new Elijah, and therefore it makes sense to typecast Jesus as the new Elisha because Elijah was Jesus's forerunner, etc. There's also a thoroughgoing Davidic messianism in Luke's Gospel where Jesus is presented as the reigning and coming king. And Luke also has a kind of a heavy emphasis throughout his Gospel on referring to Jesus as Kurios, the Lord. And that's partly because Luke is picking up from the Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in which Israel's God is routinely referred to as Kurios, the Lord. Of course, Luke has a second volume, the book of Acts, which he's going to write, and so there are other things that could be said, but let's leave it at that. John's Gospel is usually and rightly regarded as the most Christologically distinct. It's not irreconcilable with the synoptics by any stretch of the imagination, but nevertheless it's right to see John as somewhat distinctive. John begins his Gospel with that famous prologue. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, etc., etc. John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and pitched his tent. He tabernacled in our midst. John 1 is this magnificent Christological rewriting of Genesis and Exodus. He's the creator God in the beginning. That's Genesis 1. And he's the God that, just like Israel's God in Exodus, rescues them from Egypt and tabernacles in their midst in Exodus 20 following. The creator God of John 1, Jesus, the pre-existent Logos, Jesus himself, creates the cosmos and eventually tabernacles in Israel's midst. And that tabernacle temple theology is a major feature of John's Gospel. Jesus is the creator. Jesus is the true temple. Jesus is the Son sent by the Father. The fact that the Son is sent by the Father, and that the Son will then, in John 14 and John 16 and John 20 and 21, send the Spirit, is a major feature of John's Christology and pneumatology. There's this dynamic of inner enrichment and inner enjoyment between Father, Son, and Spirit. And there's this dynamic of sentness. The Father sends the Son sends the Spirit. The Spirit gathers up the people into the Trinitarian life. The Son is equal to the Father, it says in John's Gospel. The Son Jesus has many discourses in John's Gospel where he seems to be quite conscious of his divinity. It's not an easygoing consciousness. He's not walking around saying, man, I am super well aware of being the second person of the Trinity, and I've known that my whole life. But it is nevertheless a deep and robust spiritual, theological confidence that he is somehow intrinsic to the God of Israel in a way in which no one has ever been or ever will be, and he is somehow revealing the God of Israel in a definitive way, in a way in which no one ever has or ever will. So there's a Christological consciousness on the part of Jesus in John's Gospel. There are also passages in John's Gospel, though, which have been puzzling in terms of Jesus is the Father is greater than I. What sense does that make? Is this what some scholars have called a subordinationist Christology? How can Jesus, if he's fully divine and of the same substance as the Father, be subordinate to him? Or is it a temporary subordination, or what? Lots and lots of questions. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are magnificent, and I've said enough about them at this point. There were other developments in non-canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, written sometime in the 2nd century, probably in Egypt, is a collection. It's not really written by Thomas. It was written by some Egyptian Christians which had Marcionite, ascetical tendencies, and they have a Jesus that rejects the Old Testament, who rejects large parts of the Jewish tradition, who doesn't seem to think of himself as divine, but who simply sees himself as some great teacher of wisdom. The Gospel of Peter is a gospel in which Jesus is, it's a passion and resurrection gospel, which is quite a bit like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but nevertheless has some very odd bits where when Jesus comes out of the tomb at the resurrection, the cross comes out of the tomb behind him as though it's kind of anthropomorphized, and Jesus in this massive body ascends up to heaven. So it's got some interesting but odd features trying to depict the divinity of Jesus in ways which might have made sense to some of the readers of that gospel. There were other apocryphal developments in apocryphal gospels about the childhood of Jesus, because the canonical gospels are so silent about that, save Luke, which has a story about the young boy Jesus in the temple. Christians were naturally curious about that, so lots of developments about if Jesus was divine, when did he become conscious of that, what sense did that make, and how might he have acted as a child. Lots of material here to reflect upon and to think about, and I hope that it stimulates you and challenges you in your own Christological thinking.